Okay, I'm Amethyst Dunn. I am an archaeologist. I have a bachelor's in anthropology, and I'm working on my master's in museum studies. I grew up in the '80s, so I'm an Indiana Jones kid. You know, um, so as you grow up, you realize that it's not Indiana Jones esque. So I went and got my degree in anthropology, because that's how you get into archaeology. And then uh, how could you not want to be in this? I mean, some of these pieces are 10,000 years old. And then just the idea that I get to hold it and curate it and, identify what they are is just, it's an indescribable feeling. And museum studies for my master's is because I would like to be able to run my own site. And there's only a handful of ways in there, and, museum is through one of them. So during the course of this project, we have found quite a few things that were really interesting. We found the galena, which is the ore for lead and silver. And then we've kind of helps identify the projectile points that come with it. We also found a rare set of projectile points that I was able to do the research on, and found that it actually starts in the late Archaic here in the southeast, but moves up as it moves up to the northeast. It becomes middle woodland. And then we also had the nice little surprise of finding a bone in the collection, and then having to ascertain whether it was a human bone or an animal bone. So we were able to come definitively that it is an animal bone.
Good afternoon. I need Sue to tell me good afternoon. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
She always answers back. Welcome to the Bartow History Museum's, what month is this? May. Lunch and Learn. We're glad to have you out today.
Yes.
Thank you. So before we introduce our speaker, let me give you a couple of upcoming announcements. First of all, if you will, silence your cell phones, please. All right, this is what's coming up. We will not have an evening lecture this month, so enjoy the extra long Memorial Day holiday. But we'll start back with 2 lectures next month. On June 17th, a month from today, will be our next Lunch and Learn. Dr. Seneca Vaught, who is a professor of African Studies at Kennesaw State University, will be here to talk about the history and significance of Juneteenth. And our evening lecture on June 25th, that's a Thursday night, Mary Norton will be here to do an encore presentation of her Alphabet Collins presentation. If you missed it a couple weeks ago, come hear it because it's a great presentation, lots of great information. If you were here, come anyway because she's going to actually give the whole presentation that she wasn't able to give that night. And while you're here, see the exhibit that's on the other side of the wall here on Alphabet Collins so you can get a feel for who he was. We also in June have 2 camps coming up. A camp for 5 to 7-year-olds on June 8th to June 12th, led by Miss Abby. And she's very excited about it.
I am. I'm so excited.
It's called Wands and Warriors. So it's going to be
7 or 70?
Well, we could do a 7-year version.
I'd love for you to come.
And then our camp for 8 to 12-year-olds on June 22nd through the 26th called Myths of Many Lands. There are still openings in both of those camps, so if you're interested in that, I suggest you go to the website and sign up quickly. All right, that's all I got. So, let me set the stage here for our program today. Amethyst Dunn, was an intern with us this semester. She's from KSU. And on her first day here, she came into the office ready for her project. And I was afraid to give it to her. She's going to show you some pictures, but there was 3 or 4 boxes full of, Sarah, how would you characterize it? Rocks? I was like, I'm going to give her this box and she's going to run out of the building screaming. Luckily for us, she did not. She took that box of lithics and points and pottery shirts, and created this incredible wealth of knowledge for the Bartow History Museum based on what she found in those boxes. And she's going to share that with us today. Amethyst holds a bachelor's degree in anthropology and is currently pursuing a master's degree in museum studies. With a background in archaeology and a strong interest in material culture, Amethyst brought valuable knowledge and enthusiasm to the museum's efforts to better understand and care for the artifacts in its care. As our intern, she assisted with a project focused on identifying and classifying a variety of stone and clay artifacts within the collection. Her work supports our broader efforts to document and interpret these materials, ensuring they are properly understood and preserved for future study and exhibition. Outside of her volunteer work and academic pursuits, Amethyst enjoys spending time with her family. She's been married for 22 years and is the proud mother of 4 children and proud grandmother of 2 grandchildren. Please join me in welcoming Amethyst Dunn.
So I have been an archaeologist for about 3 or 4 years now. Since here it's the Southeast, so most of it is indigenous artifacts. So I can't see this. So just for a little bit of background, because up here we do have some examples of them, but they range from Paleo-Indian, and each time period is broke down into early, middle, and late. So Paleo-Indian, there's not a lot of supporting evidence in Georgia. There's only like 200 sites that have been confirmed Paleo. So this is when the environment really changing. There was mass extinctions of horses and camels. We did have camels and elephants here in the United States for a while, but we also had mastodons and mammoths. And when the time changed, when the environment changed, so did those animals go extinct. In North Georgia specifically, since this is where the collection is found, is in Northwest Georgia, we were looking at hardwoods, which like oak and hickory. They were being replaced with spruce and pine. So this time period with Paleo is pretty much defined by the projectile points, because that's all we really have for them. So it's Clovis, and they span from California all the way to Georgia and Florida. Okay, so Clovis points range. Some of them are very, very large. When in our classification of large, you're looking at maybe 3 to 4 inches. And then we have bands that we were talking about. These at this point are nomadic. So we're hunter and gatherers still at this point. So you were grouping in bands about 25 people, no more than 25 people. It's easier to feed 20 people than it is to feed 50. So base camps for this time period, we're giving to it more nomadic life. And as I mentioned before, in Georgia specifically, there's only about 200 confirmed sites because they were so nomadic. They were mostly out in the south, out in the west. And then we have archaic, and which is also broken down into 3 subperiods. And archaic is more going to be looking at, we're still hunter-gatherers, but we're still small groups, but we're starting to have some temporary encampments because we're kind of moving with our resources. But we don't have any evidence of stored food, so pottery is not an issue right now. They have, so I am so sorry. At this point in archaic, this is when they're still nomadic, so we are moving along the river. So here it's the Etowah that dumps out into the Coosa, and then it goes up to the Tennessee River Valley. And this is where different groups would come together to socialize, they would trade resources, and they would also look for mates. By the time we get to middle archaic, your climate's starting to change, and the pine and the spruce are really starting to take over. With the late archaic, there's less permanent settlements, but we're still moving around, following our resources, but they're just not, the territory we're expanding is not as much. So we're staying pretty much local to where we are. And then the housing, there's, like I said, they're not permanent, but but a little bit of we have found, they are circular small houses. And then we have woodland, and this you're looking at it's starting in 1000 BC. So this is where you're really starting to see ceramics coming in, where they're storing food because they're starting to be a little more permanent. They're also starting to use sand and grit for tempering instead of vegetable fibers, which they were using at the late archaic period. They're being decorated more elaborately, so you're looking at, line and incised and dotted. They were using stamps. They would carve it out in wood, and then while the clay was still soft, they would press it in and then let it dry. And as it's heating up, it kind of becomes permanent. Some of the pieces, you can actually see the scorch marks on the pottery, so that you can see that some of them were used for cooking. When you start getting into like late woodlands, early Mississippian, you're starting to see where the bottoms are burnt as well, because they were used for heating, and some of them were not super sure if they were caught in a fire or not, because the burn pattern was quick and hot. So when you're also looking at settlements becoming larger, so the settlements are becoming larger and they're becoming more permanent. They're starting to clear forests and fields. They are starting to commit to horticulture, but corn is not a process yet. There's no real evidence for that. There's just here and there we have some. Woodlands is also where you start seeing the mounds. So like, Etowah Indian mounds, that is a burial site. The main one out there, I think it's called Mound C, has an elite buried in there, and then all of the people, like his, anybody that was staff for him, family, and the ground around those mounds also have burials. So and these are going to be like parents, children that may have died, for whatever reason, uncles. It's going to be more, because this is where your elite lived. And then all of his staff, all of his family, this is where his shamans were, people that were important to the hierarchy. And then we come to Mississippian, which is where you're going to start seeing the mounds not be as prominent, but they are starting to be, they're still being used, just not as much. They're becoming more ceremonial, starting having more in rituals. And then we have, I lost my stuff. That's not nice. But this is where this is also where it ends. So 1550 is when the Spanish come in. So this is when the time period stops, and this is right at start having the Spanish contact. We're not super sure. There's not a whole lot of evidence that any of them could really bother Etowah, because Etowah was a huge powerhouse in the Northwest. So there's some record they talk about, we didn't really bother with them. They kind of just did their own little thing, and then they moved on to somebody else. So this is the collection that I was introduced to. 4 boxes. I think one of them just says stones on it. But in the boxes, there was pottery, and there was a big box of broken projectile points. Some of them were not able to identify by time period, just because they had no tips, no stems, no nothing. But this collection, based off the information they were given, was found in the 70s. It's all surface collected, which just means that they were walking their property and they're just laying there. So then it was in Bartow County, which, fun little thing, is that where they found it is 10 miles from the Etowah Indian Mounds. But it's also only 5 miles from a site that another archaeologist has been working down there at Cummings, the Cummings site. This is in Cartersville. So it was donated to the museum in 2002, and some pieces were already on display here. I believe it's upstairs, or some upstairs that are on display. But in the box we had pottery sherds, so that lower right box is nothing but boxes of pottery sherds. Just broken pieces that have to be eventually gone through, and it's just going to be a very large project. And so we have worked stones and points, and then the other box had intact projectile points. They just weren't identified. There were some pottery sherds in there that were a little better condition, and then steatite. Steatite is most people would know as soapstone. It's really, really soft when it's handled a lot. And they would use it to sharpen their projectile points. They would use it to grind grain. They would use them for just they would use them like cooking platters, like a pan. And then there was also just a box of more sherds, and then there was some tools in there like hammer stones, like hoe tips, because where they break, because it's just stones. If you hit a rock just right, they will snap. So that was the collection that was introduced to. So now we go into cleaning. So when we're cleaning projectile points are kind of easy to clean. They're, which is what we have up here. They're pretty much a basin of water. You want it to be kind of warm because you want it to break down, especially in the South. Red clay gets in there and it does not come out. Generic toothbrushes, paint brushes to kind of get the dust off to help clean them, and then the soft cloth to help dry them. We can dry them off on the soft cloth and let them air out, or you can put them on newspaper, brown paper bags. Pottery, on the other hand, has got to be a little more delicate because you can actually scrub off any decorations that are on there if you scrub too hard, and it does absorb the water at this point. But that is how we got them all cleaned and ready for display out there in the exhibit. Up here, we did put some pottery out here, and they are dusty with the paintbrush up here, so it's very messy. So we're trying to get the points identified. So when I was given the box, there's probably 2,000 points in the box. And they're just labeled as projectile points. So I had to go through, the tools I would use would be a caliper, the rulers, kind of side by side, because there was multiples of some of the projectile points. With the pottery sherds, some of them had been so used, and we're talking about land that's been cultivated multiple times, so some of the designs have been rubbed off, just through use in nature. So if you take rice paper and lay it over something that's got a faint design, and then you use charcoal sticks, you can gently rub it in there, and the charcoal will fall in the slots that would normally be there, and then it'll show you how to identify the pattern, so we can identify what the pottery was. These were the resources that I was using to compare, because each one of them will always tell you something different. This one has, it's 4 millimeters wide, and it's got a basal bottom, and it's got hafting. And hafting is where they would kind of nap it so it'd be a little thinner at the bottom, so it would slide into a spear or an arrow, or a hoe for a stick so they can cultivate. Projectilepoints.net was really helpful because it's not complicated to use. It's super user-friendly. It gives you a lot of information as long as there's information to be had on the specific point. University of Georgia Archaeology, you have got to really, really, really want to use that. They are not user-friendly. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of manipulation to the web pages. So unless you are just needing that information out of that one, it's not user-friendly at all. The New Georgia Encyclopedia, it is a wealth of knowledge for a lot of things. It can tell you about the time periods in Georgia. It will tell you and it's not just prehistoric time, it's history of Georgia. And it's all cited. It's very credible site. I think it had some sections on dinosaurs. I think me and my son were looking for dinosaurs, which ones lived here and which ones didn't. So it's a wealth of knowledge on that one. And all of these are online. Google Scholar will help you, if you're working on a specific piece, Google Scholar will give you the papers that were written on it, any information that was ever written and published. Peach State Archaeological Society, which is actually a society, and you don't even have to be an archaeologist. You can be amateur. Just somebody who likes to go outside and pick up the points, and you can join this society, and then you can also use their site. They have an artifact ID page, and it's super user-friendly too. It literally says artifact ID, and it gives you anything from points to beads, apparel, pottery, even some European goods when they used to trade them. So that one's really nice. It's got a wealth of information outside of that as well. And then there's reference books you can get. They have Peach State Archaeology actually publishes 3 or 4 books of projectile points and pottery so that you can actually have it in a physical form. So they are all very great, and this is the ones that I was using to identify what we've got. So in this collection, they gave us a lot of surprises. So galena. So if nobody knows what that is the ore that we pull lead and silver from. It is highly toxic if you inhale it. and it was just laying in a bag, no warnings, no nothing. So I did isolate it, so now it is, but I didn't know that until I actually was already had it in my hand and moving it around, wiping sweat off, and I'm like, oh, okay, so that's fun. But it is also how we identify Copina triangles, which is the 3 projectile points up at the front top, because if galena is found and those points are found, then we know what they are. And it's, so like I said, they're late archaic to early woodland, because some things from one time period will always kind of carry over until there's no longer a use for them. As you can see, the sides of them, you can see where it has been napped, the little grooves you're seeing. That's what we call flint napping. And they would take a hammerstone, which is up here as well, and they were so precise on it. They knew exactly where they could hit the stone that it would break it off. And they would do this until they got what they were wanting. So I think that, so you can see where it's even got serrated edges on some of them, and they were these were very meticulous and very well made. So the dark black is a very high quality chert. I think most people know it as flint. And then the top one, it's chert, it's just not as good of quality, which is why you can see cracks and where they had broken off. But galena was used it was used for decoration on pottery. It was used during ceremonies and rituals. The thing is, they actually used it as a kind of like a makeup for face decoration, because they didn't know it was going to kill them. They didn't know it was going to make them sick. So, but the one that's in the exhibit, you can actually, I don't know how well you can see it because it is isolated. It's in a box, and then it's in another box. So you can see it, but you can't access it, and it can't release any dust. But you can see in the middle where there's a divot where they were using it to, scrape off some dust for it, and then you can see where they have actual scratch marks in the middle of it. So it was that was always a lovely surprise when we opened that one. And then this one, this is the other surprise. So this Brewerton eared point, I had to do this one I did the research for this one for one of my artifacts finding class. We found out during my research, these are really poorly made, so they're very rare. We don't really know why during this archaic to middle woodland they just weren't making them as well as they should have. But it started in the southeast, so we're talking like Alabama and Georgia, and since where they were found, we're only about 30 minutes from Alabama. But as I was doing the research, we found out that it starts here in Alabama, Georgia, and then it moves up the Tennessee River Valley up into the northwest. So it starts here, and by the time it ends up in the northeast, that it actually ends up being the middle woodland time period. So what they were finding with them is not the same as what we would find here. Because pottery changes, resources change, the whole environment changed for these, but it did follow up the Tennessee River Valley. They say it was poorly made, but the one on the lower left, she cracked. She's missing an ear. And you can see where the tips on the other top 2 are missing. But this bottom right one it's pretty well intact. She's got some, but we don't know if that's damage from use or damage from like a tractor or, it got hit on a rock. So that was, and was able to give that research to the museum so they can use that for them, because since they're rarely made, they actually does make them a little valuable. When I was part of the research I did, I found out that like the one on the lower right it can go to auction for up to $500 for just the one projectile point. The one that's kind of broken pretty badly with the divots inside of it, it goes for about $150. So it's a nice little feather in a cap when you're looking at stuff. So the best surprise though was finding a piece of bone. So this was up in the box labeled stones. When I went to go empty them out and everything, this lovely little fellow fell out, and all it had was bone. Doesn't tell me if it's human bone, doesn't tell me if it's an animal bone. So this could trigger NAGPRA, and then it opens up everybody to liability. So the NAGPRA is the Native Americans Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. This basically says that any remains that are found have to go through these people. We have no federally recognized tribe, so it goes to a council. But luckily, I was able to avoid a lot of stuff. But if I had not had the resources of having my mentor being able to come, I sent it to him, and then he sent it to a zoo archaeologist, and we did come to find out that it's either a deer or a cow. So we looked up that it was just animal, but if that had come back as human, well, now it involves the police, and then the police are going to come out here and go, oh, well, now we got to get a coroner out here, the ME out here, and he's going to go, oh, it's not a new body, it's an old bone, which then triggers a bioarchaeologist to come out, and then she's going to go, it's just a person, it's not anything important, or she's going to say it's indigenous, and then that will trigger NAGPRA to come out, and then that's a whole other outside of my scope of anything for that one. But luckily it was just an animal. But you can see I am not a bioarchaeologist. I deal with material culture. But you can't, I was medicine for years. I worked in hospitals. I could tell that it was a long bone. I can tell that it was cut post-mortem. And this is where this is here. You can see because there's no remodeling of the bone. It was a clean cut. It didn't break. So somebody cut it. And then we weren't, my professor that I sent it to, he says he's not sure 100% that was not purposely cut into the top of the bone, or if it was just the way the bone kind of degraded on its own and then over time. But that was a funny little shock when you open up boxes and a bone rolls out and you're like, oh, well, that's going to be fun. So, but it was, like I said, I was fortuitous in the fact that I did have resources that I could pull from. Because it's never good for anybody to have to call the police to come, hey, I found a bone, and then it triggers a whole stem of stuff. NAGPRA probably wouldn't care a whole lot just because, it was found in the 70s. So it was before NAGPRA, because NAGPRA wasn't even enacted until 1990. But it is a massive headache when you find any bones. And like I said, look, we didn't have to pull in a bioarch because bioarchaeologists, their consultant fees are pretty hefty. Because that's a wealth of knowledge they have. They know all of the bones and all of the markings, and they could even bioarchs can even tell what you did for a living based off of how your bones are worn down over time. If you did a lot of, shifting from shoveling from here to here, like, indigenous people would have done, they're going to see it in your spine. Your vertebrae are going to have little marks where it shows where it's been worn down. So we had those nice little surprises. I do believe that was the end of that one. So do we have any questions or? Yes.
Most of the tips you had look like they went on a spear or an arrow. I mean, is it more, do they go more on spears or more on arrows, or anything they wanted to shoot? Or?
There's really no way to tell. Hafting, like I said, Hafting kind of leads us to believe they went on arrows because the bow and arrow kind of shows up in about late woodlands, Mississippian. So this is why we just call them projectile points, because we don't know what they were attached to. Because it's organic, so it's going to degrade over time. And when you're looking at points that are, 500, 600, 700, there's points in here that are 10,000 years old. We're never going to know what they were attached to, so it's what we just call them projectile points.
How are they attached to the arrow or spear or whatever?
Twine. They would the vegetable fibers. They would kind of twist them up, and they dry them out, and they become super strong, and then they would attach them that way.
That was pretty much their own defense and hunting, just those primitive spears and arrows.
Yes, but they're pretty. So Dr. Powers runs International Archaeological Day, and I believe it's in October. One of his colleagues is what's called an experimental archaeologist. He creates the huts, the houses over in Etowah Indian Mounds. He made those. So he made a tool that was used in the Mississippian times, because this is when warfare starts. He made what's called an atlatl, and it's like this. It's a little stick, and it has a point at the end of it. Inside when you have a long spear, And then you put it up here, it sits up here, you hold it, and then you launch it like it was a baseball or basically a baseball. And I have launched that thing, and it put a hole inside of it about that big, and it was a little point. So they're pretty lethal, we're not. But he did use twine to do that, and they were used for warfare, but they're mostly hunting. We didn't really start warfare until, because this is where you're starting to see fortifications, more permanent settlings where they were about 20 dwellings, and some of them would actually encircle an open plaza. But they have some evidence of wooden palisades and ditches. So this is where you're starting to see warfare, and this is where the bow and arrow is introduced. But it was still mainly hunting for deer and rabbits and stuff like that.
So how does the museum establish provenance? I mean, you get stuff that's donated to you, and you have to make sure it came from private land, not public land, or whatever. How do you do that with objects like that that don't really have anything written on them?
Well, the provenance for this set did come with, some of this stuff has to be good faith. You're taking stuff, you're taking our indigenous artifacts, and you're taking it with they're being honest. And so it was private property. I did go through the provenance and I did research it. This one was actually already appraised. But so yeah, I mean, it's good faith when it comes down to it. Yes, if you got caught, as long as we've had it, there's really not going to be a whole lot of huge liability for it. But if you're caught stealing off of public land, boy, you're probably going to be wishing you hadn't. They have, Indian Mountain says if you find it on the ground, leave it on the ground, get a ranger. If you get caught taking stuff from a site, you're looking at minimum of a $50,000 fine. Minimum. And you can land into jail for up to 5 years. They do not play with indigenous artifacts. I can't even pick them up. I have to leave it there. And this is literally exactly what I do for a living. They just don't, it's hard to, but when museums get donated, they have to take it on good faith that they are not being lied to, that there's a chain of custody for it. And the provenance it's where the address is they were found, it is right off the Etowah River. It is reasonable to believe that it was surface collected. So,
That's part of our process. I mean, it's a good question.
Sorry.
We have to ask those questions of the donor. And like Amy said, in good faith, trust that they're telling us, yes, this is my land, I found it on it. I didn't go digging, I surface collected it. And when this came to the museum, the donor didn't know any of this information. So we took in what we did know as far as where it came from. And we're, like she said, there's a couple pieces upstairs. We're able to research a little bit, time period. We're able to do some of those pieces. But, what she then took out of those boxes, flesh out, if you will, the story of these pieces is just incredible. But that's one of those things where we have to be real careful with the donor. Make sure that he's on the up and up or she's on the up and up. If there were remains, we wouldn't obviously take them. We would have awarded it to the proper authorities.
Does it make a difference if it's surface found or dug up on a private property?
I don't know that it does. It's not private property.
private property is private property. So if you walked out into your backyard and you saw this beautiful piece, that's just this intact, beautiful pottery, it's yours. There's nothing we can do about that. NAGPRA can't step in. Now, if you go out there and you decided you want to build yourself a pool and you find a body out there, well, now you've got to report that. Because, they don't, you got to report that for a lot of reasons. NAGPRA aside, you've got to report it just so that, make sure that it's not, that could be somebody's loved one. So you definitely want to call the police regardless. But bodies, remains, if you find remains and there's grave goods in it, then you definitely want to make sure that you get the police out there so he can get the ME out there so you can trigger the people that you need to trigger. And the county will usually take care of that. The Cummings site over there in Cartersville, it's about 5 miles from Etowah. He did find a body. It's the remains of an indigenous. It was how they were at that point is that to honor their elders, they would put them about at the door. So he can't find the door yet because the house burnt down. There was a huge fire at this site, so most of it's burnt. So he had to, since he's the archaeologist, now he's got to get a hold of a bioarchaeologist, which is also at the school. So she came out and she goes, "Oh yeah, this is definitely indigenous." But he had to have the police out there first to make sure that it wasn't a new body, that it was an old body. And then she comes out and she goes, "Oh, this is indigenous," which then triggers NAGPRA to come in, and then they decide, and then they can decide that are going to take the remains and they're going to repatriate them, or they're going to say, "Leave it alone, you can't do nothing." So, and that's what he did. He covered it up. He doesn't bother really with that area a whole lot. It's just one of those like, hey, there was a house here. You can still see the posts that were used to hold it up. This was the remains. Please be respectful of them. I think where his site is, they're actually building a neighborhood down there. To Cartersville soccer fields down that way. They're building a new complex. So they had brought in other archaeologists, the ones who actually, like CRM and stuff, and they have found several remains out there. NAGPRA's like, okay, so you're going to leave them there. You just have to make green space for them. They can't build anything. Nothing. All they can do is maintain it because most of it's Cherokee, but there's not a Cherokee here. They would have to go to North Carolina or Oklahoma. So they just leave them there, just make green space for them.
Did they move all those bodies then over to this one green space area, or just?
Oh no,
They just left them where they were found?
they leave them where they are because that's what NAGPRA said to do. The NAGPRA council goes, "You're not to move these. They stay where they are. You figure out how to work around that." So I wouldn't want to buy a house out there because I know what's out there, but they're probably not going to tell people there's remains out there.
With the pottery, does it once it starts getting decorated, that means it's newer? The older stuff is displaced?
Well, see, up until late Archaic, there was no pottery because they were nomadic. They didn't store anything. Late Archaics, when they were still using vegetable fibers to make, to be the binding agent for it. So you're not really going to see a whole lot. Anything before the late Archaic. Anything after late Archaic, you're going to start seeing when they're going to become more. They're going to have more designs. There's going to be
because they're going to be trading them, or just because they want to
yes.
look cool.
Oh, I mean,
you know that?
So the answer is yes. They did trade it because it's a resource, and everybody likes pretty stuff. They're not any different. They may have. It could have been nothing more than, hey, this one here says this is all grain. This one over here says it's all water. So we have no real way of without sending them off for testing, and that testing can be decently experienced. I did see you. Okay.
How do you tell the difference between a pottery design that was imprinted versus something that was maybe just drawn by hand
So.
or incised by hand?
So there's a piece in the exhibit that's incised and dotted, and you can see there's a difference. Most of the time, like some of this in here is cord pressed, and they would just take twine and wrap it around, and that's what they have. It's called cord pressed. It's most of the time it was on wooden paddles. If they wanted to make us check, we have check stamped, and the wheel bank's complicated. It's also a wood stamp, so we could just. I guess it's just everybody's research before that. We kind of they knew, and now it just trickles down to the new ones like me. And we just go like, hey, I haven't got to figure this one out now. You've already done it. So it kind of just benefits us that we had archaeologists before us. So, anybody else? All right, so I do have points up here and some pottery. We did bring up the Brewerton ear so you could actually see it, and the bones in there. We just ask that you leave the bone in the bag, so it doesn't get oils or stuff in it.
Well, let's give him a hand. Like she said, you're welcome to come up and take a look at some of